I'm not an American. Well, at least not ancestrally. Sure, it's what's written across my first passport, and it's where I spent the first 28 years of my life. But ancestrally, I'm from all over Europe. A Swiss, Irish, British Isles Ashkenazi Jew. Rolls right off the tongue. And in fact, it's actually back in Europe, where I've lived the past 10 years, that I feel most at home. But as the United States of America celebrates its 250th anniversary, I gotta admit, I'm grateful for America. Though, not necessarily for the reasons you might think. My name is Joe Bauer, an American who emigrated to Germany 10 years ago and became a naturalized citizen. And in this video, I'm celebrating America 250 from Berlin by looking back at my own connection with the United States and why I kind of would have been screwed without it. The United States is not a particularly popular place at the moment. I know this because as soon as I said just one nice thing about the country in last week's video, throngs of anonymous commenters came at me in the comments. It didn't matter, and probably never will for some, that I regularly critique the United States in the videos I post every Thursday at 3 p.m. Deutscher Standard Time. I've just come to accept that some people just have an allergic reaction to nuance, particularly anonymous faces on the internet. But this video, or scripted ramble if you will, isn't a defense of the United States. I mean, honestly, how could I defend all 250 years of the US? It's a country founded off Native American genocide that kicked the can on slavery for its first 90 years as a nation, all the while ironically singing the praises of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all men supposedly created equally. And that's just what we've done within our own made-up, at times violently so, national borders. The Lord of the Rings extended cut trilogy isn't enough time to run through the crimes the US government has committed across the world. I mean, Laos and pretty much all of Latin America with certainly like a word. And there's simply no making up for that. I mean, you can't host a World Cup and be nice to people and think the world will cut you some slack. Right, me from last week? So this is not a defense of the United States during its 250th anniversary, so much as it is an acknowledgement of one simple, cold hard fact that happens to be pretty important to me, and that is me. I don't exist without the United States. Look, I know that might sound a bit self-centered or egotistical. I can already hear the keystrokes of someone typing, "typical American." I am absolutely not saying that the country's violent history was worth it all just so I could show up on the scene. Average runner YouTuber does not balance out for the crimes committed by the United States. But I honestly think that this is something many Americans can relate to during this national anniversary. We're all here in large part because of our country's history, even the ugly bits. We might live a certain way now or advocate for specific things in spite of our country's history, but we're here because of it. And that can be a wildly uncomfortable admission to live with. I certainly don't love it. Even more uncomfortable, the alternative for us wasn't always much better. Let's look at my family history as an example. Growing up, I generally knew that I was a bit of an ethnic mutt. But moving to Europe rekindled my interest in genealogy, and I started tracking people and stories down. I know, for example, that my Irish ancestors, the Quilties, came during the infamous Irish potato famine. Maybe my ancestors would have survived if they stayed. It's pretty impossible to say. But they immigrated to the United States, had a daughter, and she married my great-great-grandfather, himself an immigrant from Switzerland. You might be thinking, ooh, Switzerland, poor guy, I'm sure he had it rough. Okay, well, these days, Switzerland is indeed a wildly wealthy country, and not just financially. And I'll admit that after my first visit, I did ask myself why old Leon Bauer didn't just stay in Switzerland. But back in the late 19th century, Switzerland wasn't a particularly wealthy country. Leon came from a massive farming family. As far as I can tell, they were poor, dirt poor. The only thing they had a lot of were kids, and this was a time when kids were born not just out of the soul-aching desire to be a parent, but because they were also free labor. I presume he left for the US for the same reason why millions of others have throughout history. Simply the opportunity for a better life. Whether or not that opportunity is still there is something I'll come back to later in the video. But perhaps the most obvious alternate universe to consider are my Jewish ancestors. Now, I knew growing up that grandma's parents came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but it wasn't until living in Europe that I truly appreciated just how large of a space that actually encompassed. You got your Czechia, southern Poland, southwestern Ukraine, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and roughly half of today's Romania were all part of the empire. As I've talked about before on this channel, living in Germany, das Land der Täter, as they say, the country of the perpetrators of the Holocaust, really pushed me to dig into my Jewish roots. I mean, we're talking about what if in this video. A Jew of any kind living in Germany can't help but wonder, what if? So I started to dig into those Jewish roots. Where were these great-grandparents of mine actually from? Now, I will spare you the montage of me digging through websites, emailing archivists, and bugging my family for any and all details. Suffice it to say, I was eventually able to pinpoint with relative confidence precisely within the former Austro-Hungarian Empire my great-grandparents came from. First up, we've got Dubin, a shtetl outside of Bardejov, Slovakia, and Siget, right on the Ukrainian border of modern Romania. Siget I first heard of when I took an ancestral trip to Slovakia. After tracing my roots, I decided to take the bus up to Krakow and visit Auschwitz because I was told that that's where Jews in that area were sent, and I wanted to pay my respects to distant cousins long lost. While there, I purchased a copy of Elie Wiesel's Holocaust memoir, Night. Elie was from Siget and talked about it in some of those early pages of his book. Only later did I find out that I'd eventually be heading there myself because it's where my great-grandmother was born. People tend to think most Jews came to the United States after the Holocaust, but Jews originally started immigrating to the US in large numbers during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I mean, that's when my Jews came on over. Fortunately, before the horrifically xenophobic Immigration Act of 1924 that limited the number of immigrants allowed entry into the United States. Jews were among those the US wasn't so keen on welcoming into the country anymore. And look, we don't have to play too many mental gymnastics to figure out what would have happened had my great-grandparents stayed behind. Today, as an example, there are no Jews on record living in Bardejov, Slovakia. In Siget, estimates say about 80 to 100 people. Compare that with around the time my great-grandmother would have lived there. Jews made up 40% of the city. As best as I can tell from my research, they had at minimum cousins who were murdered in the Holocaust. The sad reality is, they probably wouldn't have fared much better had they stayed. I've actually been to the old synagogue in Bardejov where I was told Jews were rounded up before being shipped to the camps. I saw the drawings from Jewish children forced to live in hiding, and the names scratched into the walls in hopes someone would remember them. So yeah, when I'm in a room like that, possibly where a cousin was forced to say goodbye, I'm grateful my great-grandparents were already long gone to the United States. And I can imagine some of you are thinking, well, it didn't have to be the United States. Jews from that time period went to places all over the world, to South America, to South Africa, Australia, Canada, all over the world. But my ancestors didn't. They went to the United States, and I'm alive because of that decision. Here's a quick, kind of darkly funny side story to break up the tension. When I went to Siget, my wife's German work colleagues asked her if I still had family in the area, not knowing that I was there under, let's say, Jewish auspices. So when she said, well, he's Jewish, let's just say you could hear a Stecknadel drop. My ancestors on all sides of my family did just about everything you're supposed to do in the States. They worked hard, provided for their families, and made sure the next generation had it better than they did. Granted, that was admittedly a pretty low bar when you're surviving the Great Depression and preemptively escaping the Holocaust. But hey, they did it. They all, in many respects, achieved the American dream. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But for me, those same opportunities just didn't seem to be there. At least not quite like it had been mythologized in school. I graduated college with enormous debt, credit card debt, no health insurance, and car insurance for a car I couldn't afford and didn't really want anyways. The US didn't seem like the land of opportunity for me as much as it probably did for my ancestors back when you could afford to live a decent, respectable life off the back of one salary. The land of opportunity for me was someplace else, Europe. At least that's what it seemed like when I was in college and first got this idea about living abroad, perhaps somewhere in Europe. In most European countries, I could have avoided college debt, I wouldn't have to worry about medical bankruptcy, and I wouldn't need to have a car in my life. In Europe, I'd be free from debt and car dependency and free to build the kind of life I actually wanted to live. And for the most part, I have. It's worked out pretty nicely. I live in a gorgeous neighborhood with parks, wide sidewalks, easy access to public transportation to get around the city, country, and continent. And I'm generally not worried about, catastrophe striking at any moment, whether it's an unforeseen medical issue, gun violence, or, pick your normalized US headline. Don't get me wrong, I can find plenty of things to fetch about. But as I reflect on America 250 from abroad, I'm realizing that these two seemingly contradicting things can be true. I'm grateful to the United States, despite, everything. And I'm glad I left, because I'm just doing what my ancestors did, pursuing life, liberty, and happiness. Now, if it were the 1930s, I probably wouldn't be hanging my hat on Europe. But today, in the year of our Zelda 2026, this is where I feel I have the most liberty and ability to live a life of happiness. I imagine that's because, in my humble opinion, the United States has moved away from those values that made it the dream of just about every aspiring immigrant around the world. And in the meantime, other countries have caught up and surpassed the United States as a place where you can live your best life. Yesterday, it was the American dream. Today, I'm all about the European dream. Things will inevitably shift again in the future. And that's because the dream isn't actually attached to the US or Europe itself. These are all lines on a map made up by humans. What it's really about are those core human values of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And today, for me and the way I like to live, namely car-free with the freedom and ease of mobility across my city, country, and continent, it's Europe. Tomorrow, who knows? For now, I'll look at the US like you might a really old grandfather. They have some wildly inappropriate, outdated ideas and beliefs, but damn it if you don't love them all the same and are grateful for what they did to get you where you are. So happy Independence Day and 250th anniversary, America. Thanks for helping me live my European dream.